Don't be shy, you can come in closer if you want. My name's Lisa, I'm with Farm Folk City Folk.
And I'm Siri, I'm with Farm Folk City Folk 2. I'm the Lower Mainland Seed Coordinator.
Oh yeah, and I'm the new Vancouver Island Seed Security Program Coordinator, so I've just been hired last month.
I wanted to start by, first of all, acknowledging that we are on the unceded traditional territory of the Lusanic, and they are still our neighbors in and around here. And so part of the reason why we acknowledge that is not simply to recognize that they are here and they have been here for a long time, but also as part of reconciliation, we want to tap into the wisdom that they have held for a very long time. And that wisdom is about becoming connected to the land and to become connected to your neighbors as well. And so we would like to acknowledge that and then welcome you to High Grove Farm in that spirit. We are very excited that you're all here. It's amazing, the turnout. And we're very excited that we can be hosting this kind of presentation. And what we want to be about is how do we make connections between ourselves and also and how do we live in harmony with all of our relations and respecting our ancestors. So welcome to High Grove, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. So important when we're talking about using the land. Thank you very much for that.
I'm just sorry, I'm just going to jump into.
Yeah, sure.
I'm just thinking that once you guys get started talking about the seed processes and machines and so on, that we're all going to disperse. So I'm just going to quickly jump in with a couple of thank yous and announcements, and then everybody can move on. So yeah, first of all, thank you, Ben, for having us all here. Thank you, Karen Campbell over here, who's wave, for being a coordinator. She not only coordinates the whole thing, but she also cooks food for the whole morning crew. So thank you so much. And grows it, yeah, grows it, cooks it, everything. So thank you. Karen is also the driving force behind the Pender Seed Library, so which is a new thing that was started this year, and so we're saving seeds now, and we're hoping. Well, I'm quite sure, not even hoping. For sure, there's going to be seeds from today that will be donated to the Pender Seed Library, and seeds should be free, and so that's part of the whole ethic of making seeds available to the community for free. So I just wanted to quickly say that we have funding for this whole thing from the CRD Community Works Fund. So I just want to put that out there. Thank you, CRD. And we also, speaking of funding, we just recently got a grant from Van City to put on a soil health education program in the winter. So that's the details of that are just being figured out, but it will be across all 4 Gulf Islands, because the Gulf Islands Food Co-op works across the 4 islands. So winter time, when the growers are not busy out in the fields, we can get into some field days and educational stuff. Ben Dunsmuir, hand up, is going to be a big part of coordinating that, and we're partnering with Kwantlen Polytechnic University. So we have university soil science people helping, but a lot of it is about just connecting growers and having farmers come together. So stay tuned for details.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Roz. Thank you so much, Karine, and our hosts, Ben and Roland. I really appreciate this space, and thank you all for coming out. I guess with that, we'll get into it. Also, I just wanted to mention, we have a sheet over there that you can sign up to our newsletter, and also I'm going to be sending out a survey next week, mostly about the kind of seed cleaning equipment, but it's really great for us to know kind of quantities and varieties of seeds that we're cleaning, because it can help us in funding in the future, so I would really appreciate it. You don't have to sign up for the newsletter, but we'll send you the survey for sure. Okay, great. So we'll start with just kind of the background of the importance of seed saving. So gardeners and farmers have been saving seeds for as long as agriculture has been a thing, which has been 12,000 years. And it's only really in the past century we've seen a major shift to purchasing seed annually instead of from commercial seed growers rather than growing it out from our own gardens and farms. And with the commercialization of seed that we've been seeing, it increases seed patents and which increases barriers to seed saving, and also it's kind of reduced the amount of seeds we have. We've lost 75% of our crop diversity in the last century, and I think a lot of that is because we are growing fewer amount, just some of the same varieties across the board, especially on large scale farms. And right now we have the top 10 seed and chemical companies controlling 67% of the market. So 2/3 of all our seeds are coming from 10 companies. And these companies are, you hear the words like Monsanto, which was bought out by Bayer, and they have stakes in agrochemicals, so they're going to be producing varieties that work really well with fertilizers and pesticides because they want to sell those products too. So I think it just kind of shows the importance of local seed production and supporting your small growers. Right now, in Canada, there's over 8,000 varieties that are only grown out by one producer, and I think that's shocking because if that producer stops producing it, then all of a sudden there's no more market, we lose it. So I think people underestimate how much power you have, because if you as a gardener decide to save one of those 8,000 seeds, you're effectively doubling the amount of seed, you're effectively doubling the amount of people growing out that seed. And if eventually that commercial grower wants to retire, or who knows, has a major crop loss, the fact that you as a gardener could bring that variety back and you could repopulate, I think it's a really powerful tool. And one person can make a big difference. So yeah, I was saying we have seen a big loss of crop diversity, and that will, all in all, that leads to a decrease in food security. Do you have anything to add?
No.
Great. So some of the importance of crop diversity is when we have a diverse pool, we can protect against all sorts of catastrophes. So we can protect if there's a big disease problem one year, or we saw this year with the drought. If you have a diverse population of plants, at least some of it is going to be okay when you get those kind of intense catastrophes happening. And I think we've seen in the past that having the genetic, like when we limit our genetic diversity, that problems can occur. We've all heard of the Great Famine in Ireland that happened from one potato being grown out on most of the island. Phytophthora, a fungus came in, took out the whole crop. So if they had been growing a few different potatoes, maybe that wouldn't have happened. And also with the whole Gros Michel banana wipeout in the 40s, we had to switch to a whole new banana. And there's other advantages of crop diversity too. It's just keeping your options open. You have something?
No, you're covered it.
Okay, great. Great. Yeah, so some benefits of seed saving is you can be self-sufficient. You don't need to buy seeds, so you can maybe save some money, and you can increase your seed security in the local area, share it around. Also, there's a huge, I would say, culture around seeds. It's really special when this is my Pender Island bean. I've been growing it here. My grandma grew it here, and now it's kind of my own thing, and it's been passed down, and it kind of, seeds carry stories. They really do. And you can also, a great part is have a local adaptation. A lot of times when you're buying seeds that are coming from far away, they're not quite right for our BC climate, and you can really hone in on the things that you kind of like. So, and I think that's great, because if you're seed saving, you can slowly over time, you don't have to, be a plant breeder, but even just by saving seeds, you kind of are a plant breeder, because you're selecting which ones you're going out, and that's pretty cool. You can decide, I don't want to bend over and get my peppers, so I'm going to try to just pick all the big ones, so when I get older, I can just walk around and not have to bend my knees. Excellent. So yeah, this is just seed saving versus breeding. I think they're pretty intertwined, but seed breeding is usually just a bit more active process. I think we have a general idea of that. Okay, now we'll go a bit into just plant knowledge, learning about some plant structures, functions, and vocabulary. So what is a species? Species is a group of plants with specific characteristics that are capable of interbreeding. And within a species, there can be lots of genotypic and phenotypic differences. Genotype is what you don't see, phenotype is what you see. So oftentimes we find that plants that look different can actually be the same species. Like kale is the same as broccoli, is the same species as Brussels sprouts, and if we're growing those crops for seed, they can cross-pollinate and you might get a cool Brussels sprout kale crop, which is me. But maybe that's not what you're looking for. You just want Brussels sprouts, you don't want that. So that's something when you're seed saving, definitely looking at your species is an important step. And then cultivar, it just describes a cultivated variety. It's not really anything much different than a species. It just means we've been growing it out for food and domesticating it over time. And also feel free to put up your hand and ask questions at any point during this presentation. Happy to make this more dynamic. And then heirlooms is kind of a word that's thrown out a lot. It's just an open pollinated variety, and by open pollinated we mean that the transfer of genes is uninhibited between the population. So pollen can pollinate all of, will travel, it's not impeded.
Within the species.
Within the species. And heirlooms are open pollinated varieties that are usually have been around for longer, and they generally have excellent flavor. They're not as popular in stores because they generally haven't been selected for packaging, shipping, and shelf life, but they're really great for backyard gardeners. You definitely, if you're a farmer and you take your heirlooms to a chef, they get pretty excited about that. Do you want to talk about open pollinated?
Sure. Yeah. Again, we're talking about open pollinated. So when we're talking about saving seeds, this is the only kind of seed you can save from if you want your parent to be true, or your plant to be true to type. So when I say true to type, it means the baby from your seed is going to be the same as the parent. So hybrid seeds have been modified so that, not genetically modified, I shouldn't have used that word, so that what you get won't necessarily be true to type because it'll give you different genes. So you can't, F1 is often how it's referred to in seed catalog. It gives you wonderful vigor because it's that hybrid vigor coming from both parents, but it's not going to give you seed that is the same as what you planted. So it's a recipe for disappointment if you try and save seeds from anything that's a hybrid or an F1.
So yeah, when you're looking at your plant labels, usually the first there's your genus and then your species, and then if you have a cultivar, it'll usually say it. That's usually how it's written, and then there's a few other small details, but that's generally, if you're trying to figure out what your species is, that's kind of how to figure it out. And it's okay if your genus is the same as a different plant, they won't cross-pollinate, it's just the species specifically.
So that's like if you have a Brassica gynecea, which is a mustard, it won't cross-pollinate with a Brassica oleracea, which is a broccoli. But all of the Brassica oleracea will cross-pollinate. So that's kale and Brussels sprouts and cabbage, I think?
Yeah.
And broccoli, and so that's a big one you have to be careful about.
And then when people talk about land races, they're just talking about a population that's existed in a certain area for a long time. Oftentimes land races, we usually refer to them more mixed grains and forages. That's not just one specific variety, but they've been growing out a forage for a while of mixed plants year after year. And usually that's what people are referring to when they mean land race. They're very genetically diverse and flexible, and since they are going out each year, you get some selection pressure, so it does eventually kind of work best in your environment. So, do you want to go over plant cycles?
Sure. Most of the plants we see on a farm scale are annuals, but there also are biennials, which is important when you're thinking about saving seeds from plants. So, your biennials are going to take 2 years before they give you seed. So that's things like beets, onions and leeks. What else? I'm drawing here.
Carrots.
Thanks. Yeah, carrots. parsnips, many others. So then you have to think, that's going to take up space in your garden for 2 years in some way. So you really want to be mindful of that when you're doing your planning, because it is a commitment. Yeah, and perennials are going to be plants that are there for a long time, many flowers and that kind of thing.
Yeah, trees. Here's a picture, just the flower parts. This is really cool if you're doing hand pollination. We're not going to go into super detail about that. But basically, this is showing the male flowers. We've got our anthers up there that host the pollen. And then in the female flower, you have your ovules. That's what eventually turns into your seeds. And your ovary is what generally turns into your fruit. And the stigma is where the pollen lands, and it goes down the style. And yeah, so pollination begins when pollen lands on the stigma, and it grows down to the ovary. Yes, this is just what I said. Monoecious plants are just referred to ones where the male and plant organs are in the same plant, and in that things might be perfect. Flowers, which are when we have the male and female organs in the same flower, like tomato, for example, or pepper. Plants like that oftentimes are more likely to be self-pollinated than cross-pollinated, and then imperfect flowers are kind of like your squashes, where you have your male plants and you have your female flowers. They're on the same plant, but on different flowers.
Spinach, too, is another one.
Yeah.
Dioecious.
Yeah, and then dioecious refers to plants that have male and female organs on completely separate plants. So some olives are like this, and same skimia is like this. Cannabis is another one. So of course, when you have a dioecious plant, you'll need both male and female to create seed. Versus monoecious, you can usually get away with one plant.
Do you end up just with that process finding a bunch and hoping some are male and some are female? Is that natural, or is there a way of choosing?
Yes, generally you're growing out a bunch. There are ways to figure out the sex of your seed. I don't really know how that works, but I know in like cannabis production, I've definitely heard of people talking about these are female seeds, because people don't want to get male seeds, and because they want the bud. They won't get it without that. So I think there's a way, but I'm not quite sure how you can tell from the seed. But generally, once the plant grows, you're able to see.
Yeah.
Even often early times, sometimes leaves will be different, or as soon as you see a flower, you'll be able to identify if it's a male or female. So
on the squash plant, you can see the squash fruit. That's an easy one to see. And spinach, it's a different like stalk, where you can kind of see like the growing difference. So it just happens naturally if you have a big enough population. If you had only like 3 or 4 plants, you might be in trouble. But
yeah,
not
the nurseries they'll often write down like if it's a male or female plant oftentimes.
Oh,
Yeah. So yes, things are either self-pollinated or cross-pollinated. There's some examples of both of them. So self-pollinated plants, the pollen comes from the same flower or different flowers on the same plant. Naturally, self-pollinated plants have a high tolerance to inbreeding. So generally, if you have a cross-pollinated plant and you keep on pollinating it, the same plant over and over again, you might see eventually the vigor goes down. But self-pollinated plants, they've been grown to be self-pollinated, so they're doesn't affect them as much. And populations are largely homozygous, which just means the seedlings look like parents. Homozygous is kind of a genetic term of when you have 2 alleles of the same locus. I won't go too much into it, but feel free to ask questions if you're curious. Some characteristics of self-pollinated plants is sometimes they're self-pollinated because the flower never really opens. So of course it can't really get pollen from somewhere else. That'll be your peas and pansies. And sometimes it'll be the pollen usually shakes up before the flower opens. That happens with a lot of lettuces and wheats. And then sometimes it's just a physical thing, like there's a flower part that kind of blocks the pollen from escaping, and that will cause that plant to be more likely to be self-pollinated. Cross-pollinated plants, do you want to talk about cross-pollinated plants?
Sure. Pollen comes from different plants. Actually, no, you can go for it. I don't know.
Okay, yeah. And so with cross-pollinated plants, if you're trying to keep the same variety and you are growing out two varieties, cross-pollinated plants, generally you'll have to have your plants far apart to avoid crossing, or we think about isolation oftentimes in distance, but there's also isolation by timing. So you could grow the same variety of a plant, like let's say you could grow broccoli one year and then the next year it'll be in flower. You can still grow a different broccoli as long as they're not flowering at the same time. They're not going to cross-pollinate. And some cross-pollinated plants are not compatible. Like even if the pollen lands on the sigma, it won't germinate. They have some different enzymatic reactions.
What is dioecis?
Dioecious, that means it has separate plants, male and female, that are on separate plants.
Oh.
Yeah. So yeah, a dioecious plant is always going to be cross-pollinated, for sure.
So a question about saving seed from squash. So I have a machada and a pepo growing, and so they shouldn't be crossing with each other.
Exactly.
But there's the whole sort of valley that I'm in, and Barry's bees, or somebody's bees, are coming from somewhere. So there's pretty, like, I don't know, like, is there pretty much no chance that I could save the seed from any of these anyway? Because the bees are coming from all over.
Yeah.
So how far away? Like a mile-ish?
Yeah, when you're dealing with that, your options are kind of either netting. Netting will work for plants that are pollinated by pollinators and insects, but netting won't work for plants that are pollinated by the wind because pollen is so tiny. I don't think there's many nets in the world that will stop pollen from entering. And then another thing that you could do with squash is just taking off the flowers or taping them up so that the pollinators can't get in. And some people will do that. It's very tedious though, but if you do it for a few...
Oh, and then it's like pollinate them myself.
Pollinate them yourself with a separate flower and then closing it up so other pollinators can't get in, or putting a bag over it so other pollinators can't get in.
So how do you do it with the seed farms? You know, like we're actually producing seed for sale. Like you don't need very many.
It's pretty labor intensive to do the self-pollinating, but it can be done. Also, another thing to consider is your actual physical barriers, because even though like it might be a mile isolation to be totally okay, if you have like a forest in between you and your neighbor, you're going to be fine. It's just like you do have to consider, if you have on the farm, one of the farms I work at, we have so many pollinators because there's so many seeds. So our pollinators really get around, and we know that, so we need to actually have larger distances. So it does sort of depend on your variables. Yeah, but it's a bit tricky. The butternut, is that a muscata? Because that one you can get away with a little bit more easily, because most of them are going to be very similar. So unless you're really particular about your butternut variety, that's usually the only muscata people grow, is butternut. So you might be able to just save that and not worry too much if it's a Walton butternut, or I think that's enough one, or another kind of butternut. Thank you.
Yeah. So just where to start if you wanted to start getting into plant breed, seed saving is, as I was saying earlier, like we're plant breeders and we don't even know it. Even if you just leave a plant out in your garden and you let it seed and plant itself, that in a way is seed saving, despite you didn't take it out and package it up. But who's to say that going around and getting your snapdragons and going like this at fall, to me that's seed saving. So some things when you're starting is, farm and garden design. So planting is usually the first step. So just things to pay attention to is, your crop variety and kind of its characteristics. So thinking about if it's, what kind of flower type it has, and if it's self-pollinated or cross-pollinated. Then isolation distance is another thing to think about, how far away. And then population size is another one. So generally, especially commercial seed growers, they're going to have a certain amount of plants that is, they're deemed to have captured the genetics of that plant if they grew out that number. So I would say there's kind of scales to it. Like a home gardener, you know, for tomatoes, I think you're supposed to really have a population of at least 10 to 20. Generally, self-pollinated plants, you don't need as large of a population because they are quite homozygous, so they don't have a ton of genetic diversity to begin with, versus cross-pollinated plants you tend to need a larger amount of, like corn. You wouldn't save seed commercially for corn if you had less than 100 corn plants, because you couldn't guarantee that you had captured the genetic essence of that variety. And
I'm just going to add one thing there.
Yes.
In terms, this is a neat idea having to do with seed libraries, where it's like your home gardener can only, you know, let's say you want to grow kale, you can only grow a few kale plants. But if you have a network of all these different people growing kale plants, and then you bring all those seeds together in a seed library, you get genetic diversity. So it's another way of getting that.
that's such a great point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's also kind of different levels of it. I'd say like that's one great way. Also, you'll see like somebody who's a commercial grower, they might do, you know, just the minimum plant population, but somebody in a seed vault or something like up in Svalbard, they might decide that, you know, we want double that amount because we're a seed bank, that's what we're doing, we're protecting that genetic diversity, we want more. And then another thing to think about is kind of market versus seed maturity. We were talking about carrots and things being biennials. They take up a lot more space the second year. So if you plant your carrots really close and you're expecting to save seed from them, and next year they take up way more space. So just kind of thinking generally seed saving takes up more garden space. And also I find I like to kind of, especially plant seeds that need to dry on the plant, kind of like peas and beans, I like to separate those even more than I would regularly, just to increase the airflow between the plants so you avoid rotting and things like that. So I think it takes up a bit more space, seed saving. Yes, so we've kind of gone with that. Yeah, so market versus seed maturity, just a bit more about that. Many plants will be market ready before they're ready to save seeds. So cucumbers, for example, usually you're eating your cucumbers when they're green. They have very not formed seeds, but if you're saving that for seed, you're leaving it in your garden a lot longer till it's yellow, till the seeds have gone hard, and you wouldn't really want to eat that crop at that point. So yeah, there's that. There's also another point about this is when you're breeding, oftentimes you have such a crazy genetic diversity and you're looking to get it down because you're trying to make a variety that people can recognize and it's kind of distinct. So generally when you're plant breeding, you're selecting even fewer plants to save seed from. Like you don't really need to pay so much attention to the population sizes, because you still have way more genetics than you need. At that point you're trying to hone it down, not keep it. So there's that too. Yeah, if you're looking for more resources, Seed Savers Exchange has a great guide for isolation distances, population sizes for various crops. And I was talking about earlier I was saying about how 8,000 varieties we have are only grown by one producer. If you're interested in growing out one of those varieties to try to protect it, Seeds of Diversity does a really great program where they send people seeds of what they deem seeds that might fall out of production to give to gardeners to try to maintain that, and they have a seed bank that you're supposed to kind of send, I think, some things back, and it's great fun.
What was the name of that again?
Seeds of Diversity. Yeah.
They have a great little guide too that's like an intro to seeds, or intro, I don't know if it's an intro, but it's a really small and good guide reference if you're new at it.
So if I grew two peppers, one that was really long and beautiful, and one that was very fat and thick, and I wanted to try to cross-pollinate them, does that become hybridization? And is there an easy way to do that?
Yes, I'd say, so hybridization, that definitely is like a hybrid crop as soon as you plant it. seed production, generally when we talk about hybrids, we're talking about, it's kind of weird, like generally like hybrids, they're talking about plants, parent plants that have been selfed so often that they are completely homozygous, like they're kind of, not clones, but they don't have any genetic diversity, kind of like they've just been selfed so many times and then they're crossed, and that's why you get, then every single gene is crossed. But for pepper plants, I'd say like since peppers are kind of generally self-pollinated, like growing them really close together would definitely help, and even trying your hand at like a bit of cross-pollinating by hand, that'll definitely kind of increase your chances of them crossing. And
But then, yeah, if you were to save seeds from the child of that, it would be pretty out there. Like it would be a hybrid in terms of its genetic diversity, right?
yeah, it would
Yeah.
look different than the plants.
Yeah.
And then you could just pick out of that next population, see if any got the
Yeah.
combination of genes that you wanted.
But in 7 years or so,
And then you might even want to self-pollinate that one, make sure it's away from other plants. If you do find one, hey, I like this, just keep on selfing it till it seems kind of stable, and then grow out a population would be kind of my, how I would go at it.
What then would create the hybrid that won't, the seeds won't create?
The hybrid, so that'll happen when the parents are constantly inbred, versus like if you even, because that's quite, when you do your first initial cross, the genetics are still kind of all over the place and you don't know what flower is crossed with what, so you get this whole big mixture of genetics. Versus, yeah, hybrids, the reason why the next generation won't be quite the same is, so your parent population, so I'm just going to do a quick genetics explanation here, I'm just going to dive into it. So you have so each gene has 2 alleles, and those are going to can be different. So I'm going to give an example of green beans. Mendel figured this out. He's a great guy, the father of botany. So let's say, I'm going to say G is green and Y is yellow. So let's say we have a GY, we would call that plant heterozygous. And then when we're creating hybrids, we're trying to make sure that every single locus has the same 2 alleles. So we're trying to make it so everyone is GG, GG, GG. And then let's say, so we have our G, 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 and then your other line might be, let's say, yellow or something, and then yellow, 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 yellow. Then when you cross them, you're going to get YG, and whatever one of those genes is dominant, that gene will be what you see. So I think for peas, yellow is generally dominant, so in the next generation, you'll get YG. And then what happens when that plant, you save seed, so that has completely every single allele is heterozygous versus the parents are completely homozygous. But then when you go into the next generation, what happens is the genes from the original parents start to show up, because you'll start to get some of the alleles are homozygous and some of them have heterozygous. So you'll have part of the plant, you know, it might be GG at one place, but the other place might be GY. This is more, I mean, that one, you kind of have to look at a few more characteristics. So you might see, I can actually have another little PowerPoint that has a bit more genetics. I kind of left it out of this one. Now I'm regretting it, because you guys are interested in this. But yeah, so if you had like a shriveled versus round seeds, so then you'll start, it's generally in predictable ways how it separates. Like Mendel did some crazy experiments where he took 2 genes and he found out genes generally, because a big important law is the law of independent assortment, which is a law that states genes will assort completely independent of each other. I mean, obviously there's exceptions to the rule. Like on a chromosome, if 2 genes are really close together, the chances of them being passed down are pretty close, versus if they're far apart on the chromosome, generally the chances of it not coming together so we call those linked genes. When we see two genes that are really hard to separate, like maybe it's really hard to get wrinkled yellow beans because the round gene is right next to the yellow gene. So trying to separate those out on the chromosome is difficult, like it would take some precision. But yeah, that's kind of why the next generation isn't quite the same. It's because the original genes from the parents start to arrange in unpredictable outcomes because it's not two homozygous plants just crossing for heterozygous. Heterozygous, anything can happen, any sort of crossing. Does that kind of answer the question?
That's good.
Okay, okay. Try my best.
Like it'll still give you.
My question was, does it produce a seed, like some watermelons where the seeds won't grow?
It does. It won't inhibit the germination. It'll just give you different.
Variances, yeah,
Yeah.
so I understood the variances,
Yeah.
I'm just saying, so us, as we mess around and we cross-pollinate, or when we have things that cross-pollinate, we're not gonna produce the same kind of a hybrid that commercially is produced so that you have to buy the seeds the next year because those seeds won't grow. Or they're closed, they're not an open pollinator, right?
Yes. Yeah, so it's a bit,
It's a whole different.
yeah, whole different, yeah.
Anything
Hybrid,
you do should stay, if it's open pollinated, it should feed the
Yeah.
offspring with you.
Yeah.
Okay.
okay, great. So now we'll go into a bit of seed cleaning and storage. So seed harvesting, yeah, we kind of talked about this, that ripe for eating does not necessarily mean ripe for seed. Also, when you're harvesting seed, as farmers and gardeners, we know weather can be your friend or your enemy, and sometimes you might have a frost, you know, late September, and you don't want your beans to be out in that frost, so you might have to cut them a bit early, let them dry inside. So I think it's a lot of observation, like a lot of gardening is, figuring out that kind of best time to harvest.
Try as much as you can on the dry crops to get them as brown and crispy out on the plant as possible, but sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes you see rain for the next 3 weeks and you go, well, I guess that's not a possibility this year. So when it's kind of basic seed cleaning vocabulary, we think about usually generally 3 steps. So the first one is threshing, which is just separating the grain and seed from the plant. So outside we'll do a little walkthrough of that too, but we saw the big red machine. That would be a more larger scale thresher, and it's just breaking it up. It's not sorting anything really, it's just breaking up the stuff. Or if you're stomping on it, that's breaking up the stuff. And then winnowing is we're separating the seed and the other parts based on the weight. So kind of playing with wind flows and getting rid of one thing but not the other. And we're talking about screening, we're talking about separating seeds and debris based on size. So generally how screens work is you usually use 3 screens. Your top screen is bigger, going to let all your seeds fall through, but not the bigger parts of materials. And the bottom screen is going to not let any seed through, but it will let your dirt particles and your other smaller debris out.
And the word chaff sometimes people aren't totally familiar with. It's just any of the debris or like broken bits of dried plant that aren't your seed.
Yes. Okay. So I feel like this is pretty good. Maybe we'll just take a minute to talk about plants with threshy fruits. So generally when we're talking about seed saving and seed cleaning, we're thinking more dry seed. But there's obviously a lot of seed that's in fruits and wet. I don't know if you want to speak to like fermentation, that kind of thing.
Yeah, sure. So for a few different seeds, like tomatoes and cucumbers and sometimes squash, you will want to ferment the seeds. And basically why you're doing that is some seeds have like a jelly kind of sac around the seed that needs to break down. It will actually inhibit germination. So by fermenting it, you're taking that inhibition away. So to do that, you kind of want to leave your seed. I usually put a little bit of water in so that I don't have like chunks of meat, say it's tomato, like poking out, they're going to go moldy. So it's like more of like a slurry. And I usually squish it up so that there's no big chunks. Such scientific language, I know. And then leave it for like 3 to 5 days. This is for tomatoes, for instance. And then you'll get like this like film of white kind of mold. And that gives you the clue that, okay, these are done, they fermented. And then you're good to keep cleaning them. So you can just keep pouring water in and then decanting the top. Because what will happen is you'll get layers. I'm thinking about tomatoes, so I'll just use that as an example. On the very top, you'll get any light tomato seeds that are actually no good. They won't give you good germination. You'll also get all of the skin from your plants and any like bits of meat that are they're all gonna float to the top. And then you'll get kind of a layer of, well, at the very bottom you'll get the good seed that's like floating or sinking down to the bottom. And it's really very easy to just pour off the top part that you don't want and then end up with these nice clean seeds, which you can then dry out and your seeds are saved. So you do need to do that for a few crops. And there's some contention around whether you do it for certain other crops. Like squash, you don't always need to do it. Peppers, some people said, I've heard people say that they've done it with peppers, which I've never done with peppers. So yeah.
Okay. So generally it's necessary to dry your seed after harvest. Seeds of high moisture tend to heat up when drying close together, so it's great to lay it on a sheet, avoid overlapping. I think a lot of these things, we talk, threshing scales. Yeah, drying is really great. And slow drying tends to be better for seeds that are very wet to avoid cracking, shrinking, and hardening of seed coats. Also, sun drying. I know, Lisa, you do a lot of sun drying of your tomato seeds.
Yeah, just to prevent, fruit fly larvae from forming, because there's always fruit flies around and that's annoying. But also, if you don't dry them super fast, they just tend to stay moist. And so they can, if they're really moist, it's an environment for them to start sprouting. You don't want that to happen. So I tend to leave them in the sun for a few hours or even a day. And then after that, I'll bring them inside. Because you don't want them in the sun for too long or they get baked, but at least to kind of get that drying happening fast.
And then seed storage. So the viability at harvest will affect the viability when planting. That's just kind of the idea that, if you harvested your arugula before it was fully formed or your tomato before it was fully formed, the seed's not going to be quite physiological mature, so that's going to affect your viability next year. Generally, when we're talking about seed storage, temperature and humidity are the most important factors. And seed longevity will really depend on your type of seed. So some seeds can last forever, and some seeds will need to be replanted every few years. Something like rice doesn't really last super long. You can eat it for a long time, but after like 3 years, you probably are going to get reduced germination.
One thing I would like to add to that is just be really careful after you've harvested it. If you haven't threshed, we do that with a lot of seeds, but you're so much more likely to have moisture when you have plant pits in there. So it's like putting things in paper bags is good, but often they will also trap moisture within the plant. So it's really sad when you open up your paper bag and half of it's moldy in the middle. So just be careful if you know you're putting something in fresh, keep air at it, keep it warm. Otherwise you might get too much mold and then you wreck your seeds.
Yeah, so some people do conditioned storage. That's great for people with seed vaults and libraries and things like that. Otherwise, we just call it unregulated. Some people might refrigerate their seeds. There's also some seeds that don't store at all. We call those usually recalcitrant seeds, and they're seeds that need to stay wet. And if they dry up, they aren't any good. There's not so many here, but in the tropics, a lot of things like mangoes, you can't store a mango seed. So that's kind of interesting, but that's usually more of tropical plants. So here's a couple rules of, oh yes.
One thing, what about insects within the seed? Will they break down, will they eat the seeds in storage, or is it necessary to freeze sometimes the seeds to kill the bugs?
Sometimes they will eat the seed. But also I think the more plant material you get off, the better, because that's what the insects are kind of going for. That's been my experience. Just sometimes if I have lots of material in there, then it's oh, there's so many bugs. But do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think if you can keep insects out, that's always the best bet. I think it's great to use kind of like jars and things like that, just closed containers for seed storage. Oftentimes I'll put my whole bunch of seed packages in one jar, and then I don't have to have a million jars, but I also have a lot of things. So yeah, kind of keeping them tucked away.
That's another thing too. One thing about jars is if it's not super dry when you put it in there, then you seal in the moisture. But that's a good trick if you have it like in a paper envelope in a jar, then there's something else that's going to take it on some of that moisture instead of your seeds. So
yeah. Then there's also such a thing as over drying. Generally, it doesn't happen.
Probably not going to apply on the coast.
No, not applicable. I find sometimes like my tomato seeds, I like to put in plastic sometimes because they can get a bit brittle, but that's kind of just something you have to feel out.
Yeah.
If it's working, if your system's working, why change something? But if you notice all of a sudden your seeds aren't germinating so well, that's kind of when you start to ask the questions. Well, what went wrong? So some people will have, their first year they plant out their seeds and nothing germinates, and Lisa knows that's something, that's kind of a red flag, like something's going on here. So some plants need to be cold for the winter, for example, or some seeds might need to be really close to the sun because they need sun to germinate. Some seeds just take 2 years to kind of be good. Like one time I had Celtuce the first year, it barely grew, and I was like, okay, well, what's up with that? And the next year, for whatever reason, I had much higher germination. I'm not sure if that was something in the storage or just needed an extra year.
Yeah, so don't throw it out.
Hard to say.
If you don't have good germination, just don't throw it out right away because you never know. Germ test it again the next year.
Yeah.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, I often wondered if the little desiccant packages that you get in things like, vitamins or whatever,
Yeah,
if
sushi.
you throw them in a jar, is that an effective way of controlling the humidity that might be in there?
It helps. I do that. I wouldn't swear by it, but I definitely do it.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing to use for sure. Especially if it is a bit moist when you're putting it in, you know it's a bit moist. Definitely that kind of thing is great.
Yeah, I always keep them from every little package of sushi or whatever I have.
Yeah, so generally just a couple rules of thumb is every 1% decrease in seed moisture between 5 and 14, you don't really want less than 5% moisture, will double the life of your seed. So that's why it's kind of important for long term. Dry seeds are great. And also for every 5 degrees decrease in storage temperature between 0 and 50, the life of the seed doubles. You can freeze some seeds, and some people do even cryptopreservation of some germplasm. I don't really freeze many seeds. I try to keep it in the best storage is somewhere where the humidity and temperature isn't fluctuating and it's just kind of stable.
The only time I've frozen them is if I have a problem with germination.
Yeah.
And then if you put them in the freezer for a few days, you recreate that fertilization. So it's like it's gone through winter, and then you can get really good germination again. A couple of flowers I've had that with, and then I think some miner's lettuce or something. Another one that didn't germinate for whatever reason, I put it in the freezer and it was fine.
Yeah.
Because you have the percentage of moisture there, is there any way of actually telling for at home?
No, not really. Not an easy way for just somebody. It's more of a lab thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
There was some. Yeah, no, never mind.
Is using a dehydrator value?
It's probably going to dry them out too much. I wouldn't recommend it. Yeah.
Yeah, same, I wouldn't really recommend putting seeds in an oven either, even at a low temperature. I mean, you can try it. One time I had something that was just had a lot of wetness. I kind of put it on with a big fan in there. It's not the greatest.
It's a bit risky.
Yeah. So when seeds are stored at low temperatures and high humidity, which is what we generally have in BC, is kind of cool, but it's quite humid. They lose viability quite quickly when they're moved out to warmer temperatures. So when I'm at my farm, I like to put them in a little cooler. So when I take my seeds out of the storage, I put in a cooler. If I'm busy doing other farm work or in my garden, once I get to it, my seeds, it just kind of helps preserve them because it's that fluctuating temperatures that really seeds don't like to be stored with that kind of fluctuation. Yeah.
I have a question about that.
Yes.
So you were talking about you have your seeds out in the garden, you're planting, and you probably glue with you, is that?
Yeah, just
So
a little guy.
How quickly does that kind of fluctuation have an impact on seed?
I think fairly, like if you're out and if you're gonna leave your seeds out for more than an hour, I would recommend, especially if it's a hot day. If it's cooler out, I probably wouldn't worry about it so much. But even if I forget my little cooler, I just at least try to store them in a shady area so at least they're not heating up so much, because it can happen quite quickly.
Oh, so just so that I understand what's actually happening inside the seed when it's in a situation like that, is it because it starts to activate the seed?
It can be different things. Sometimes it'll be it starts to activate things. Also, sometimes the water, like that's why it's not great, I think, like freezing and thawing, because you know your water inside your seed is expanding and contracting, and that's something that can break up the inner parts of the seed. I also think there probably is some, because seeds definitely do have triggers from the environment that cause reactions. So I think probably heat sometimes might trick the seed into thinking, oh, I should start to germinate, but doesn't quite get to there, and then it's kind of delayed for afterwards.
And I don't know if this is true, but I found that they're more sensitive the smaller the seed is. So it's like if you have a larger seed, like say you have beans, you could leave them out and it wouldn't be impacted. But if you had some kind of like sensitive, tiny little flower seed, that's where if you leave it out for a couple hours in the sun, you might just kill it.
Yeah, so types of conservation, we usually talk about in situ or ex situ, just meaning in situ on site, so plants are grown in a natural environment. Usually used more for non-cultivated plants versus ex situ is kind of storing. So that's just in situ, like you're growing out your plant and it's maintaining a certain genetic diversity just by being alive, versus ex situ is kind of taking your seeds and storing them at a different site, or taking tissue culture and storing that somewhere else. Yeah, and just some, botanical gardens, stuff like that, seed libraries. Okay, so that's kind of what we've got to say about seed cleaning. Then I was just going to go over a bit about our nonprofit, Farm Folk City Folk, how we can help support you guys, and kind of a bit about our programs. Great. So one of our programs is the Citizen Seed Trial. This is kind of a variety trial for gardeners or small-scale farms. This year we did snow peas, tomatoes, and beets. And people got sent 2 different varieties, and we used the app SeedLinked to rate certain traits of a variety. And SeedLinked is pretty cool. We've been working with them for a few years, and they're trying to have a really big database of a whole bunch of varieties and kind of having the time to maturity posted, you can see the ratings that people have given it. I think it's quite interesting and cool. So we've been doing this since 2016. Some of the benefits you get some seeds, and then you get to engage with plant breeders. We often put on a few webinars throughout the season that are kind of relevant to your crop, and then just kind of some educational opportunities. You also get to have the chance to try to save your own seed. We try to kind of explain and walk through that process with you. People have told us that it's increased their healthy eating habits. You got to enhance your gardening skills because you're growing out some crops. And I think the best part of it is you're really part of community. We have a great Facebook group, and people will go on there, what's wrong with my tomato? And then you've got 5 people from across the province that are like, this is what's wrong. And it's kind of pretty instant, and I think it's a great for everybody, but even just starting gardeners to have that kind of support. And you can, send me an email or send somebody from Farm Folk City Folk an email about these crops and kind of get some more information about them. And we send out around monthly emails just on kind of updates about the crops or more information about maybe their history or seed saving, that kind of thing. So that's one of our programs. And then a kind of larger scale of that would be our CANOVI, Canadian Organic Vegetable Improvement Program. That's a nationwide project put on by the Bauta Research Committee. I guess it's a 5-year program that's a collaborative network of farmers, researchers, and industry stakeholders. And we're trying to test varieties for adaptation to agro-ecological practices. So often we'll send out a whole bunch of varieties. Right now, rutabaga, that's part of our CANOVI trial. Another big one we're doing this year is radicchio, because those are both crops that would overwinter well in Canada. So trying to increase our food security by having crops that can grow in our environment in the cold season. And so at the end of the seed link, you'll kind of say if you grew it in a hoop house or a container or what kind of situation you grew on to kind of figure out what varieties might work better in those kind of situations. Also, we're looking at nutrition and flavor, so that's why we've got the tasting trial out with the QR code. Again, we're using the SeedLink app and figuring out kind of what we could produce seed in Canada and what varieties would make more sense to grow out on a larger scale. Yeah, like for rutabaga, we're really looking at nutrition, flavor, and also resistance to clubroot, which is a problem in a lot of farms. So that kind of thing. And I've been hearing from you guys here that flea beetle is quite a challenge with rutabaga, so that might be something. Insect resistance specifically to flea beetle might be something that we would test for in a future year, as we, like last year when we did rutabaga, we were just kind of looking at disease resistance in general, and then this year we went, no, we're looking at disease resistance for clubroot. We're not so worried about that, so kind of honing what we're looking at and finding what varieties work best, because it is, you do notice a difference from one variety to the next. One can get completely blight and the other one can be fine. So it's quite interesting, and just kind of figuring out with those crops that aren't so common here. It's also kind of building farmers' capacity for trialing and breeding. And if you're a farmer interested in the CANOVI program, you actually get paid to do it, which is really nice. I think it's a couple $100 stipend. So it's kind of just,
I did it when I was farming before I was on this job, and I found it to be helpful because you still get to sell the product.
Yeah.
So you get paid to plant it, and then you get paid to report on it, but then you also still get to sell the product. So it does take a little bit more time in the field because you're making like all these notes, but it's also kind of fun if you're a bit nerdy about stuff. So
yeah. Our BC Seed Gathering is a biannual conference we have that brings together folks working across the seed sector. It's really great. That's how things like BC Eco Seed Co-op has kind of come to be, and we put on different, this year it's going to be mostly virtual with a few in-person tasting events, but in a way that opens up to people on Gulf Islands like Pedder Island, because you don't have to come all the way over to the mainland to experience this conference. So it'll be kind of different this year, but it's happening from November 18th to 21st. Definitely would encourage all of you guys to come. We'll have lots of fun activities. We're also going to do an open mic night, so if anybody is a musician, let us know.
Where is that again? Where do we come for that?
It's going to be virtual this year, but generally it's hosted at KPU.
yeah, virtually.
And sorry, the dates are November
18th.
Yes. Yes, and then our Seed to Food project, I added this one in because I launched it last year. It was launched in 2020 as a response to the pandemic, and the idea of this is that food tends to be a byproduct of seed production, and oftentimes it can be a bit of a waste product. Like people saving tomato seeds generally don't eat the tomatoes, they just mash it up and ferment it. So the kind of idea of this project is trying to see if we can find economical ways using some enterprise budgets. We have some enterprise budgets for seed saving too on our website. That's pretty great. Trying to see if we can find economical ways to save both the seed and the fruit. For some it's really easy, like kale. Your first year you can harvest all the leaves, leave it for seed the second year, no problem. Other crops it's a bit trickier to figure out, and some crops it's just never going to happen. Like cucumbers, you're never going to be able to eat that cucumber and save its seed, but trying to see where we can do. And Yeah, I was trying to just increase food security. We donated to an organization called Food Stash. Last year we saved 1,700 pounds of food. This year I think I've already delivered probably 100, 200 pounds of food, so it won't be as much. We wrote a lot of food specifically for this program last year because we had funding for it. Now it's just kind of specific funding because of the pandemic or response grant.
Where does your funding come from?
For a whole bunch of different places, but we're really grateful for the BC Ministry of Agriculture. They were the ones who gave us the money to build up our mobile seed cleaners, and that's really great. So we get some money from them for that specific program. Last year, the Seed to Food program was funded by I keep want to say United Nations, but that's that's not it.
UNFP?
No. I'm trying to remember. And then our Citizen Seed Trial was for many years funded by Patagonia, and
The Vancouver Foundation is another one.
Vancouver Foundation. Lots of things. If any of you are doing co-ops, we do have Tiffany Hellman. She finds all of our funding, and I'm sure she's happy to share kind of where she finds funding.
Van City too is another one of our funders.
Yeah, Van City did our CST trial for a while. Yeah, so our City Saturday Capacity Building Project was just a project to try to connect people across BC with their CD Saturdays and kind of talk about problems that's going on at CD Saturdays or just boosting each other's events. So right now, big identifiers is that, seed libraries, oftentimes seeds go out, but they don't come back in. So kind of one of our things that we're talking about BC Seed Gathering this year is what we can do to solve that. Another problem, CD Saturday, people are finding that it was harder to attract seed vendors, so we're going to try to have a cross conversation between CD Saturday people and seed vendors to see if there's alternative ways we can work together. Like, could a CD Saturday, is it the work that the seed vendors don't have the time to come to a CD Saturday? Maybe they could send the seeds for the CD Saturday people to grow it out, or maybe it could be more of seed vendors just sponsoring CD Saturdays, or and that's BC Seed Gathering is a really great place to have those kind of cross conversations to figure out how we can better support each other. Also, we on Farm Folk City Folk, we have a CD Saturday calendar that lists all the CD Saturdays. I believe Pender Island is on there, and we also send out advertisements and that kind of thing. And we have a shared resource document for kind of planning CD Saturday events for new people getting into it. So yeah, our mobile seed cleaner, from Ministry of Ag, we've cleaned over 100,000 pounds of seeds, over 50 varieties since 2018, and I'm sure this tour we've done a lot too. Some of the benefits, obviously reduced labor time, that's number one. Increased germination, because when we talk about germination, even though your seeds might be germinating, when you do a germination test, you're picking out random, like you can't pick out the seeds. If you have chaff in your seed storage and you randomly pick up a piece of chaff, that's what you're testing the germination on. And of course that's never going to germinate, but that's the CF, the Canadian Food Inspecting Agency, that's the way they require germination tests to be done, so that's how you do it.
So if it's cleaner, then it has better germination.
It has better germination, yes. Not so important for home gardeners, but for commercial growers, it's pretty important. It's also a great educational tool. It was really fun out at Nanaimo. We had some, Duncan, we had some kids out, and I know our boss David, he had a whole field trip come out to see the mobile seed cleaner, and that's quite fun, and just kind of getting people more interested in seeds.
It's like something they start in preschool, everybody grows a bean.
Yeah.
So they identify with it, because they're like, I've done this before.
Yeah. So that brings our presentation to an end. Do you have anything to add before we?
No, just thank you for listening. Hopefully it was helpful. Please feel free to come ask us questions. We're gonna continue on our seed cleaning, and that's, bring us seed and we'll figure out together how we can make it cleaner.